Hi, welcome to Storytelling Animals, the Green New podcast of climate, ecology, and animal justice. I'm your host, Dayton Martindale, and today I'll be talking to Lauren Ornelas, who's the founder and former executive director, of the Food Empowerment Project. She has spent decades in the animal rights movement, been involved with a variety of other social justice causes, and we talked today about why our food choices matter, and also questions about farm worker justice and racial justice in the food system and how colonization impacted what people eat and food access in communities of color, and a lot of questions about food that your typical vegan or animal rights organization isn't necessarily foregrounding, but that through Food Empowerment Project, Lauren has really tried to I think, make a connection between issues of animal rights and issues of human rights. Yeah, I hope you enjoy this interview. Um, One more thing to add before we get started. As regular listeners may know, I host a book club for Patreon subscribers to the podcast at $7 a month or more. But if you are curious to attend a book club meeting, but don't know that you want to commit to supporting this podcast on Patreon yet, now you can. So you can sign up, there's a link in the episode description. I have a weekly free email list where basically just once a week I send out the new episode of the podcast for that week. If you sign up for that email list, you can just let me know, and you can come to one book club meeting at no charge without having to sign up or anything, just to see what it's like. Our next two meetings, I think I'm pretty excited about. The next one is Tuesday, April 26th, to discuss Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, obviously a classic in the environmental movement that I have never actually read, so I'm excited to rectify that and discuss it and why it may have been so influential. And then in May, Tuesday, May 31st, we'll be talking about N.K. Jemisin's The Fifth Season, which is a fantasy novel about a world with a dramatically changing climate. That was recently chosen by Esquire as the best fantasy novel of all time. It won a bunch of awards, and I also haven't read it yet, so I'm excited to read and discuss with all of you. Again, if you want to join either of those book club meetings, if you want to join both, the way to do that is to sign up on Patreon for just a monthly payment to help keep this podcast running. You'll get early access to episodes as well at patreon.com/storytellingpod. But if you want to just try one of those out without any long-term commitment, you can just, well, there's no long-term commitment with Patreon either because it's a monthly fee, but with no monetary commitment at all, you can just sign up in the link for the weekly newsletter. Okay, on to the interview with Lauren Ornelas. Hi, I'm here with Lauren Ornelas, the founder of Food Empowerment Project. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So yeah, there's a lot I want to get into. I know you've had a long career in animal rights and social justice organizing, but maybe just start with telling us a little bit about what is the Food Empowerment Project and why'd you found it.
Sure. We are a vegan food justice organization, and our overall to help connect issues um, in the food realm and trying to give people tools to help create positive change in the world. So we work on promoting veganism for the animals, but recognizing that by promoting veganism, we are encouraging more people to eat fruits and vegetables. And so we have an obligation to advocate along with farm workers for their rights. We also work on lack of access to healthy foods in Black and Brown communities, and we're trying to get people not to buy what's sourced from places where slavery and child labor are the most prevalent. So I basically started it because a lot of these are, as a Hispanics, a lot of these issues impacted my lived experiences, and, knew that I couldn't be the only one that cared about, human rights and animal rights, and wanted to figure out ways we could show the connections in the two and help make a difference.
Yeah, would you like to talk about some of the personal experiences that led you to be interested in food justice?
Sure. So I grew up in Texas.
Okay.
I live in California now, but I grew up in Texas. And, I grew up seeing cows in the fields all of the time. And my parents got divorced when I was really young, and my mom raised my sisters and I by herself. And I think that, being taken to different places for people to take care of me, I, longed to be with my mom and my sisters. And so when I would see the cows in the fields, I would just imagine how hard it would be for that mother cow to not have her baby come back, or the baby cow not to have her mom come back. And I went vegetarian. I was vegetarian in elementary school. Um, I remember being in line at the cafeteria and the lunch woman asking me, did I want meat on my enchiladas? And I was like, no. And she was like, are you a vegetarian? And I was like, I do not take care of sick dogs and cats. I am not, I just knew, I had never heard the word vegetarian. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, it's Texas in the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't until I was in high school that I finally went vegan in 1988. But I was also raised with an understanding of the grape boycott, that was taking place, because being Hispanics, I was raised with an understanding of the plight of my people, and, that a lot of us are farm workers. And so that very much became important to me from an early age. And I wanted that to be part of Food Empowerment Project.
Mm-hmm.
Finally, as somebody who went vegetarian at such a young age, I wasn't able to stick with it. My family didn't have a lot of money, and so I had to eat what people gave us, and that was really hard for me. And so, we work on lack of access to healthy foods in Black and Brown communities, although we know Indigenous communities are impacted as well. We haven't had the privilege of working in one yet, but I knew what it was like to not be able to eat my ethics, and so that also became a focal point of our work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the goals I have with this podcast is to bring in, conversations around human-oriented justice projects, and connect them with projects related to other animals. And I think your organization and your career show a very important example of how that can be done. And I'm curious how that's been received. Like you've worked with, I guess, more conventional animal rights groups before. How do your efforts and interest in issues like farm worker rights or food access or colonization or racial justice, how is that all received in the vegan and animal rights community?
That's a great question. I would say that, before I started Food Empowerment Project, I was running an organization that it's called Viva. They were based in England, and I ran the USA chapter. And my boss in England was completely comfortable with me talking about farm worker justice issues. She was very fine with me starting, because I learned about what was happening with chocolate in the early 2000s, and she was comfortable with me talking about it within our work.
Mm-hmm.
But the US based movement was not as welcoming.
Mm-hmm.
And I received a lot of pushback. I was told I was hurting the animals when I talked about these other issues, that I should just keep the focus on non human animals. And that was really hard for me, because I just felt like it was all very much connected. I couldn't see how it was any different. If I went vegan because I didn't want any harm to come to non human animals, why wouldn't I feel the same way about the farm workers?
Mm-hmm.
Why wouldn't I feel the same about, people in Western Africa harvesting cacao? Um, so, luckily for me, in 2006, I spoke at the World Social Forum in Caracas, Venezuela, where I saw a lot of activists who looked like me, who cared about a variety of issues: immigration, environmental issues, water privatization. And that's kind of where the seed of Food Empowerment Project came from. Um, and so I would say that in the very beginning of the organization, and still to some extent to now, I mean, we certainly are smaller than other organizations that are much, much younger than us, because we don't get that type of support that maybe just 100% animal rights and, anti-factory farming organization might get. But the younger generation is phenomenal. Like, they do not need us to explain how these issues are connected. They get it instinctively. It's like something that we don't need to take time to explain why veganism and farm worker justice is connected. It's like they get it. So I would say that we're still pretty small because there's, the need for understanding in that realm. But when it comes to where we're at now from 15 years ago when I started the organization, it's a much different viewpoint, I guess.
Mm-hmm. And kind of the flip side of that question is when you do work with uh, either with farm workers or with other more human-oriented groups, but you bring vegan food to the meeting or try to introduce some framework around non-human animals as well. How have those conversations gone?
They've gone incredible. And I think that more than anything, the beautiful part of it is that people see a different way of being vegan. And some of me
Mm,
says that that's because I'm a woman of color, running a vegan organization and founded by me, which is a lot different than some of the other vegan organizations there. But a lot of what I've heard is, people telling me I've never heard a vegan talk about farm workers like this before.
mhm,
That they just never thought that we would be talking about it with the same passion, that we would talk about it in terms of, part of the same struggle. And our work on lack of access to healthy foods in Black and Brown communities has been, joy, excitement, interest, but of course, the communities that we work in, there's the problem of just struggling to be able to access that food. They're interested in it. They want to embrace it, but they have a lot of issues accessing the healthy foods. Maybe it's not
mhm,
available in the community. But we also have some people who struggle with the fact that they're on, different medications, that they have to be more careful about the types of foods that they eat. So, these are things that are more complicated. And one of the reasons why we don't go along with the it's easy to go vegan. These are complicated issues for
mhm,
people with less privilege.
mhm. What does it look like working in Black and Brown communities to increase food access? Like, what concretely is Food Empowerment Project doing?
It is really, that and the farm worker work we do is some of the most beautiful work that we do because we are with community.
Hmm.
And we get to, at least, we get to celebrate community. And so our work, primarily what we do initially is we do an assessment on the availability of, fresh, frozen, canned fruits and vegetables, meat and dairy alternatives, as well as other things like what's the signage in the windows. So we survey places that sell food except for restaurants and fast food. So liquor stores, convenience stores, gas stations, and of course, grocery stores. And after we do that, we put out a report, share with community groups to help their funding, and policymakers as well. And then we follow up when we do focus groups in the community because we know that too many times well-intentioned NGOs or government officials will start making decisions for the community, and the power and the solutions lie in the community. So we do focus groups in the community where we actually pay people $50 for their time because their knowledge is valuable. It's, something that deserves compensation. We can't just take from a community without giving back and acknowledging the importance and value of what they're sharing. We also feed a vegan meal. And then we put out our reports. We ask them questions, solutions, barriers that they experience. We put out the focus group reports, again, sharing it with community members for free, as many reports as they need to support their work, as well as policymakers. And then in the community that we've been working in, one of the things that came to the forefront was that many in the community had not heard of worker-owned cooperatives. And so we realized, but everybody once explained was 100% interested in it. So we went back into the community and we did 3 meetings, just focusing on what worker-owned cooperatives are, with the help of Mandela Cooperative in Oakland, California, came in, and we did 3 community meetings to really get them interested in worker-owned cooperatives. And we're excited that there may be one getting off the ground soon.
Oh,
Um,
cool.
yeah, so, and just, talking about it, and, we're working in other communities right now, but we still have our foot in Vallejo. We know it's a sincerely impacted community, and we're still trying to, figure out ways to work on the issues, still working with community groups as well.
Mhm. And yeah, I guess if you say that the people you talked to aren't immediately familiar with worker-owned cooperatives, it might be worthwhile briefly defining them in this conversation as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So worker-owned cooperatives are where the workers own the store. They own the meaning not the property, but they own the business. They own the decision-making power. So they're the ones who are going to decide where their profits go. They're going to make the decisions on what they want to give back to the community, and their goal is to serve that community. And they live in the community, so they're vested in the community. So instead of money going back to, say, Walmart in Arkansas, the money is going to stay in that community. And it's going to also create, entrepreneurship. It's going to help people learn all sorts of different skills if they stay there or not. But it's a powerful way to, I believe, build community and help those people who lack access to healthy foods. Mandela Grocery does a great job of, deciding EBT and senior discounts. And the beginning of the business's existence, they kept on putting the money back into the business, and then eventually they were able to have some profit and enjoy the benefits of their hard labor. But
Mhm.
there's also an ethics behind it in terms of working with other worker-owned cooperatives and standing for worker justice as well.
Yeah, you mentioned the other project that's been great in increasing community is working with farm workers. Is this the I know you're involved with providing school supplies to the children of farm workers.
We are. We work with a few different farm worker organizations. One of the things we initially did is we helped overturn a regulation in California that required farm workers living in labor camps that when the picking season was over, that they had to move 50 miles away from that labor camp, which greatly impacted the education of the children, because the children, like the labor camp near us, was open May through November. So the kids weren't allowed to go into schools until maybe May, and then they were forced to leave in November. And so by overturning this regulation, we allow the students to be able to stay for the entire year.
Mm.
Um, we also work with an organization called North Bay Jobs with Justice, where we're working on some issues up in Sonoma County where some of the winery workers are. And then, yes, we do a school supply drive every year for the children of workers. We don't see it as an act of charity. We see it more as helping to right an injustice that's taking place to farm workers and our ability to try to help their children succeed.
Mhm. Um, One thing that stands out to me is just the broad array of initiatives that Food Empowerment Project is involved in. I think you mentioned earlier that you were small, but based on the list of things you are doing and have done, it's impressive that a small team is pulling this off. Um, I think another thing I want to highlight is these cookbooks and recipes you've been
Yay.
putting out for vegan Mexican food, vegan Filipino food, and vegan Lao food. Um, what's been the response to these, and how do you decide to reach out to these communities?
Sure. So, as a Hispanics, it was really important for me to show our community one thing, that a lot of our foods were not based in animal products traditionally. And so I wanted to share delicious vegan foods that were our comfort foods without animal suffering. And so it was really important to me to reach out to our community and also show others how delicious our foods are. And so we created Vegan Mexican Food.com, and that website, the way we do our recipes, it's kind of community. Like some of the recipes are my mom's or my brother-in-law's, but also other Mexicans who contributed their vegan recipes. And so it's not like by anybody famous, it's just home cooks. And we have it in English and Spanish, and then the booklet as well. And so it was really, celebrating my culture, my people, and our foods. One of my former colleagues is Filipinx, and I said the same thing for her. Let's celebrate your culture and your people. So that's where vegan Filipino food came from. And vegan Lao food is because our very first intern and our longest serving board member, who just left us, is Lao. And so the same thing, we just want to celebrate all of our community, share our food, share our cultures with other people. And so it's really a celebration. And I think just to dig a little bit further, in terms of vegan Mexican food, another big part of it is, looking at the role that colonization has played in our diets and in our lives, in the sense that a lot of people see Mexican food being a lot of cheese and dairy, whereas, Columbus actually brought the cows over, literally brought the cows over to our continents. And
Hmm.
for a lot of us who, are indigenous to the Americas, it's not really normal for us to consume cow milk. And in fact, I would say it's kind of unusual for any human to consume the milk of another species. But even more so when you look at the indigenous aspects, you look at the fact that a lot of people use the term lactose intolerant, and we find that to be, not accurate. It's kind of putting the onus on Black and brown and indigenous people. Is wrong with us when in fact, for some of us, colonization is what brought dairy to us. And so it makes sense that we would be what we call lactose normal, that
Mm.
we do not digest the cow of another species because it's the legacy of colonization.
Hmm. Yeah, I noticed too. People can check out. I'll provide a link that you just set up a new website around the dairy industry. Um, I can direct people to that to learn more. So you're asking
Thanks.
people to be super conscious consumers of food, right? Not just animal products, meat, milk, eggs, honey, but also only buying particular brands of chocolate that you've highlighted as having acceptable worker practices. There's information on your site about bananas, which are generally produced often with very poor worker conditions, and yeah, just sort of there's lots of advice on your website and from your organization about paying attention to which foods are ethically produced with respect to the human workers, the other animals, and the environment. Um, I think this is all super useful information, but someone might sort of step back and say, "I'm just one person," or these are big systems. Why are our individual choices important?
It's funny because I go for hikes. They're gonna be like, "Why are you bringing this up?" But I go for hikes on Fridays, and I realized the other day that when I just looked at my own feet, I did a lot better than when I looked at how high I had to go up.
Hmm.
And I realize it's kind of the same thing with food issues, right? Is like if we just look at what we can do is going to feel a lot better than looking at how much we have to climb. That we have my my belief, my strong belief is that for those of us who have the privilege of eating more than one time a day, for those of us who have the privilege for thinking even about our food choices, we have a responsibility. And I want people to not look at these issues and feel overwhelmed. I want them to look at them as opportunities. There's so many things going on in our world today that we have no control over. But when we look at our food choices, we have some control over that. And I don't want to say that's limited to just, voting with our dollar. It goes beyond that. We can vote with our dollar. We need to, eat our ethics. We need to make sure that what we're eating agrees with our belief system, but we also need to speak out about those injustices. We need to make sure we take it that step further to show companies that we demand better. And I think that I so much don't want people to feel overwhelmed as much as I want them to look at it like, wow, I have the opportunity to make a difference. I have the opportunity when I go into the grocery store to say, can you carry berries that aren't Driscoll's berries? Because currently there's a farm worker boycott because of how they're being treated. To make a difference, to add their voices. We say our individual choices and our collective voices
Hmm.
can make a difference. And I strongly believe that they can. And I feel like we see it time and time again. We just need to use that, to take seriously that responsibility that we have.
Hmm. And right, and I think that feeds also into your other work around food access or around, for instance, the farm worker policy you mentioned to help keep kids in the school. That it doesn't have to be either or, individual or collective, that they can actually be mutually supportive of each other.
Absolutely.
So I want to raise, you contributed to a volume in 2011 called Sister Species, Women, Animals, and Social Justice. That was edited by Lisa Kemmerer. And I read the piece you wrote for that, and you talked about your experience as an investigator of animal abuse. Um, for so as part of kind of this podcast project, I'm hosting a book club with listeners and Patreon supporters of the podcast, and just last night, the night before I recorded this interview, we discussed the novel Barn 8, which a lot of the main characters are these people who have previously worked as undercover investigators and been traveling town to town and working in farms that they don't think should exist uh, to be able to figure out what's going on in them. And she, the author of that book, Deb Olin Unferth, really I think paints a compelling and moving picture of just how difficult such work would be to go into spaces that go so deeply against your deeply held values, um, and spend time there looking and filming and documenting. Um, so yeah, I guess I'm just wondering if you can talk a little about what your life as an investigator was like.
Sure. Just to be clear, I did never work at these
Mm-hmm.
places, but I did investigate them. And
Mm-hmm.
I would say that, I mean, nightmares are regular a part of doing that work. Um, you really, it's this is a really good question, and I thank you for asking it because I don't get asked this question a lot. Um, it's very difficult.
Yeah.
It's overwhelming. It is painful. It is, I know that, certain investigations I would go in and I would have an idea of what my goal was. Like this, I'm doing this investigation because we need to expose this. And, I was able to get in, get the footage, and get out kind of thing. But there were times when, there were injured animals and there were dead animals. And there were animals that you saw being completely and utterly disregarded as if they were garbage. And there's a helplessness with that. There's, when I did an investigation of chicken farms in Southern California, the reality, how many little beings and how many little lives we were talking about, and how it would be possible to do something to help them. I collapsed when I left the shed. I just was overwhelmed with it's like, every second, how many of these birds are killed, and how do we ever stop that? How do we ever get people to see these beings as sentient, as lovable, or if not lovable, then at least deserving of their own lives? And so I would say, a lot of nightmares, and just the knowledge that if you could get anybody, just one person, to look at these images and think differently, it was worth it.
Mm-hmm. Getting to that, looking down at your feet rather than up at the peak of the mountain.
Yeah, exactly.
One thing you talked about that I found particularly moving was the idea that you often in your investigations would try to just pick out one individual animal in each space, to just kind of pay special attention to, or lift up that particular story. Can you talk about how you made that decision?
Yeah, it was the first investigation that I did as part of a campaign. So, Eva, we were trying to get grocery stores to stop selling duck meat. And I went into this farm, hopped into the fence in the farm, and saw this adorable duckling with their feathers not even out yet, still the yellowy down, and he was just covered in manure. And I looked at their little face and took a picture and just thought, everything that I'm doing right now is for you.
Mm.
If I can get this footage, get it out, and just get people to see you like I see you, I can do this. I can hop back over that fence. Not, I can stop shaking, you know? And so, yeah, that was when I decided to do that, because it was this just precious little face.
Mhm.
I still have the picture on my desk.
Yeah, one of the kind of two main reasons that I came to call this podcast Storytelling Animals, and the first is just sort of the idea that humans are animals that tell stories, but the other is that all the other animals have their stories as well, and for ethical reasons we have to listen to them, and also just to be able to make sense of the ecological crisis we're in, the climate crisis we're in, the food system crisis we're in. Um, we have to recognize that all these problems are, public health comes down to this often. Like a lot of these problems are problems of our relations between species, uh,
Mm-hmm.
and um, you can't just look at non-humans, but you can't just look at humans
Exactly.
to really even understand what's going on, let alone respond to it in an ethical way. Um,
Exactly.
a lot of the uh, people I've interviewed on the podcast so far have been people who I think like writing is a primary part of what they do, either through journalism or academia or even fiction. And one of the I'm a journalist as well. I've written a lot, and I guess one of the beliefs I have is that telling these stories, either journalistic stories or fictional stories or via TV or movies or whatever, is an important way to raise awareness, to energize people, um, but also, you know, if there were only journalists, that wouldn't be good. Like we need actual activists, in some sense, actually doing things. So I wonder. I'm curious, just in your experience as someone who's been involved in various animal rights groups in the past and starting your own and being involved in farm worker justice and racial justice. Um, are there uh, books or articles or movies, or just does media in that sense play a role or influence at all, or even inspire your activism or help it, or is that something you think about?
Absolutely. I mean, all of the above.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would say that I know that the film that I saw when I was 17, the animals film, gave me the best overall perspective of animal rights. It's from England, but it was what I saw when I was in high school.
What was it
And
called?
the animals
The
film,
Animals film.
and it's where I first saw how they cut the beaks off the tips of the chickens, so that they don't peck each other in the crowded sheds. And I will never forget, it's burned in my brain forever, the little bleeding tip of the beak of the baby chick. But it's
Mm-hmm.
also documentaries that got me learning about what's happening in Western Africa for chocolate. I mean, that is where we've gotten all of our information. And I was lucky enough to befriend one of the filmmakers, who's since passed away, but he was my mentor on the issue. And he's really who helped guide our chocolate list, and why our criteria is what it is for our chocolate list. So, yeah, my husband is actually an author. And so, I've seen the power of words, of getting people to sit with ideas on their own terms, and being able to think about these things on their own, and how powerful that can be. Um, Definitely writing. I read a lot. I've had to stop reading so many um, nonfiction because the world around me right now is too heavy. But I mean, I feel enriched by reading. I learned about Steve Biko. Reading Mandela. Reading people like that, and reading about you know other social justice issues. I got involved in the anti-apartheid movement when I was in high school. And a lot of my understanding of using food as a tool for social change came from a book called Shopping for a Better World back in the 80s. And that's a lot of the formative basis for Food Empowerment Project is us, recognizing the different things we support or don't support by what we buy and the power of our food choices. So, definitely finding, inspiration, ideas, creativity from reading and learning. But both books and documentaries have played a powerful role in my life as well as Food Empowerment Project.
You've mentioned your chocolate campaign and chocolate list, and I've mentioned it a couple times briefly. But just because it's come up, do you want to maybe tell us a little more about what is happening in West Africa?
Sure. It's actually Western Africa and Brazil now. It was primarily Western Africa, and then a few years ago, Brazil has popped on the list of child labor and slavery prevalency. But basically, and I'll stick to Western Africa, but primarily you have a lot of um, children who come from very poor countries, Burkina Faso and Mali, for example, near Ghana and the Ivory Coast, where they go into work in the cacao industry. Their families thinking that they're going to be able to send back money. Their families thinking that they may ever see them again. You have children who are maybe sold into it by a family member, or you also have children who are stolen from marketplaces and trafficked hundreds of miles from home and are working to harvest cacao, which is what is used to make chocolate. You have kids who are beaten, who are, if they don't fast enough, if they, an 8-year-old trying to carry 100-pound bag of cacao is often beaten. Sometimes they're locked in at night. A recent lawsuit against some of the big chocolate manufacturers revealed that some of the formerly enslaved people talked about how their feet were cut open to prevent them from running away. We're talking about horrific instances of slavery and forced labor, all for a luxury called chocolate.
Hmm.
So, also have, we there are quotes from farmers in Brazil who are saying, if I didn't have this noose around my neck, my child would be in school, but instead I need their help harvesting the cacao. So you have farmers who are not being paid living income and corporations who are benefiting profusely off the work of these people. And so we've created a chocolate list that doesn't go based on certifications because there have been problems found with each and every certification that exists. We go on the prevalence of child labor and slavery being in those areas, and that creates our list of chocolates that we do and do not recommend. And we update the list every month. They have to make at least one vegan chocolate to make our list. And we also have, it's an apps. It's a free app that you can download as well on the iPhone or the Android. And again, we update it every month. And people send us companies that they want us to look into. And most companies make vegan and non-vegan chocolates, but chocolate and dark chocolate.
Hmm. Yeah, I feel like I've only scratched the surface of what your organization does. There's more educational materials on other issues on your website. You did I think a whole virtual conference on seafood and the fishing industry last year. Do do you ever feel personally or organizationally stretched thin, and how do you grapple with that?
It's such a great question. I mentioned to you before we started on the call that I'm not the executive director anymore.
Hmm.
And it's because I constantly have ideas on things that I want to do.
Mm.
And I could stretch everybody thin. When I stepped down as the executive director, we were a team of two. Now we're a team of six. Um, we're currently looking for an executive director, but like we always need somebody to hold me back because I'm like, we should do this and this and this, and that's not good for anybody's self care, right?
Uh-huh.
So no, we we do as much as because I had a great colleague who was always like, that sounds good, we should do that, And now I'm like, okay, it was a lot for just a couple people to do. So, but we have a great group of volunteers, which really helps. But Yeah, I mean, mentally, I think that what happens for me is I see an injustice and my immediate reaction is I need to do something about this now. And my mind comes up with all these solutions and then I don't have the tools, like we don't have enough funding, we don't have enough people for us to do it all, right? I can't split myself into too many different people either. And so I think that's the hardest part for me is feeling restricted and knowing there, there's just so many communities that we learn about doing the farm worker justice work that we do that I just am wanting to make an impact on. But
Hmm.
I think that, yeah, I mean, I do stretch myself too thin, but I'm thankful that I have people now that are helping me to not do that because if nothing else, I don't want that for the people that I work with. It's not fair to them. And so that's been a process for me to, really, really learn self-care for myself or try to learn it, and also really really supporting the people who I work with, the amazing people I work with, to make sure that they take care of themselves too.
Yeah, and maybe on a related note, you've what's come across in this conversation and in the research I did beforehand is that you've been involved in so many different types of activism and organizing work, from anti-apartheid high school to the investigations you were doing to your work with Food Empowerment Project, which ranges from cookbooks to uh, the chocolate list to a legislative action. So, what um, what have you learned about from all this about what types of actions and activism work best, or which you at least prefer to be involved in?
Yeah, I realized that I prefer corporate campaigning.
Hmm.
I did work in California on passing the law. Like it was three organizations that worked to pass the law in California to ban the sale and production of foie gras. Um, and I also worked to stop many, many times Adidas from trying to overturn California law, allow the sale of kangaroo skins. And with both of those, I realized that it was incredible to get these changes made, but that there's so much politics involved that a lot of times it's not about the issues or even what their constituents want. It might be more a matter of their relationship with other policymakers
Hmm.
or who's lobbying them or giving them donations. And I realized I don't do well with that. That I'm better trying to create change by using the good of people, honestly, the good of people to show corporations that we demand better for non-human and human animals alike. That we want better and that corporations need to listen and make changes, and that those changes can sweep the entire corporation. And that is more to my liking because it's dealing with the power of people.
Mhm. Do you have any stories or successes you're either particularly proud of or that are particularly educational?
Yeah, I mean, I did these investigations of duck farms, and we were successful in getting Trader Joe's to stop selling all duck meat
Hmm.
and Pier 1 Imports from using feathers in all of their products.
Nice.
So yeah, I very much believe that, and again, you see all these online petitions and stuff, and even something like that, although we were out on the street, these were before the online petitions, but are made. Maybe not always, but the fact that we can get little by little changes are important, and we
Hmm.
definitely need to celebrate those.
Hmm. Um, what what advice would you have to uh, anyone listening who's maybe hoping to start doing a little more advocacy for human and or non-humans?
There's so much that you can do, and there are different levels of your involvement, from just thinking more and learning more. I mean, that in and of itself is a lot that more people do. And then taking it that step further and taking a look at your, I used to work on electronics and e-waste being dumped overseas to developing countries, and trying to get companies to not use such toxic materials in the computers. And when I look at the food issue, I look at how many times that we have the ability to make a change with food, because you may buy a computer once every few years, and you can definitely reach out to the companies and let them know what you think and how you feel. But with food, for those of us who have privilege, we have that opportunity every day. And
Hmm.
so using those opportunities as responsibilities to talk to the people at your grocery store, talk to other people about what you're learning, speak out to the corporations, rather it be seeing if your grocery store can sell more equal exchange bananas, that are some of the few that we recommend, to shopping maybe at the co-ops instead of the big corporate grocery stores. If you can afford it, maybe they're a little bit more expensive. Maybe buying organic, even though it doesn't mean the farm workers are treated better, it does mean that they're not being doused with agricultural chemicals. So seeing all the little things you could do to the bigger things that you can do, getting more involved, finding community organizations, seeing if there's lack of access to healthy food in your community, and if there's any community groups that you can support.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that I would say in my own experience that I became vegan partly out of largely out of concern for animal treatment and exploitation, but really once animal flesh and animal products were off my plate, it kind of created more mental space uh, to think more deeply about the industry, and really it wasn't kind of until after I became vegan that I kind of wanted to start being more involved politically, or really was able to have a deeper analysis of the industry. um, it's like it subconsciously eating it was kind of preventing me from thinking clearly about it.
Right? Yeah. That's amazing. I can totally see that, because you don't want to listen. You don't want to be open minded when
Hmm.
you're contributing to it.
Hmm. Um, so yeah, the kind of last question or two to end on, your website, or the Food Empowerment Project website, says it's at 15 years. Is that correct?
Yes. We're at 15 years. I didn't start doing it full time until 2013. So in the very beginning, we were just all volunteers. In
Hmm.
2013, we had a generous donor offer to pay me $1,000 a month so I could help get FEP off the ground. And my husband and I moved to a dumpy place, and then we flourished. In 2016, we hired our first full time employee.
So what's next, or what are the plans for this year?
Well, this year we'll be turning our Vegan Lao website into a booklet. So we'll be getting one more vegan booklet out there. And we are doing our anti dairy billboards, that we have right now in Madison, Wisconsin, and in Oakland, California, that says "Got colonization" and the "Got milk" type of
Hmm.
style. So, really getting out there with the anti dairy message and making sure that we're reaching people in a way to help them understand what isn't talked about very much, the legacy that colonization still has. And that, many people may not even, I talked to students just last week. I spoke to students, and they're predominantly Latinx, and who never really thought about the colonization aspect of why it was hard for their bodies to digest milk, cow milk. And so I think that we really want to be doing more education on that, and getting that information there. We are still going to be we're doing our school supply drive again this year. The demand is even greater, but we will do our best to meet what we can to help those superstars, the children of farm workers, to succeed. We have our fight for the ocean again, with COVID being hopefully less pervasive. I don't even know how to call it
I
anymore. It's
know.
not gone. But we hope to go back out and do ocean cleanups again, to help the oceans.
Cool. And one last question that I meant to ask earlier, but
Sure.
in all your work with farm workers in particular, do do you ever end up having conversation with farm workers who work in animal industries?
We primarily work on produce workers, and
Okay.
that the reason for that is because I feel like it would be hypocritical to work on rights of slaughterhouse workers when we do not think for slaughterhouses are good for anybody,
Hmm.
human or non-animals. And so it seems disingenuous, but that's not to say that we don't very strongly want slaughterhouse workers to be treated fairly. And we absolutely recognize the horrific position that they're in, for their soul, for their body, and everything, because nobody decides they want to be a slaughterhouse worker when they grow up. And that's why their turnover rates are so high. But we feel that as a vegan organization, we also want to make sure that vegans aren't just looking ways to tell other people, here's another reason to go vegan. Look at the slaughterhouse workers, and then also don't look at how the farm workers are treated who pick their food.
Mm.
So we feel like it makes more sense consistently for us to continue to talk about, veganism and the food that we eat, and just acknowledge that it isn't exactly cruelty free given how farm workers are treated in this country.
Right. I think that makes a lot of sense. And there's maybe an analogy to people in the climate movement being concerned about, our solar jobs, good jobs, union paying jobs. Right. If we're trying to build a vegan food system, that means a food system free of exploitation should actually be free of exploitation.
Exactly. And for my old job also worked on the solar industry. So again, with the solar industry, making sure that if it's clean here, is it clean where it's being manufactured?
Mm.
Is this toxic waste impacting people in China? Well, that's not good either. Like there needs to be this holistic understanding that, all of our actions impact people locally and globally. And I feel we have a responsibility, especially those with us with more privilege, have a responsibility to others.
Hmm. I Yeah. Is there anything else you want to add?
Uh, no, but if you want a little story, I could tell you another little story.
Let's have a story.
Well, it's about my bunny Benito.
Okay.
Benito is named after Benito Juarez, who was the first indigenous president of Mexico. And I like to tell his story because what you were mentioning earlier about human stories and non-human animal stories, um, my husband and I found Benito and his mate on the streets in downtown San Jose.
Okay.
And more than likely, they were disregarded as ex-Easter, gifts,
Hmm.
and they were filthy. And we had a hard time getting them out from where they were. Unfortunately, the little girl died um, of her, actually of her spay when she got fixed. But Benito still lives with us, and he is mischievous and funny, but scared because of his life on the streets. And he also is a special needs bunny. He was born with some health issues that impact his ability to truly be like a bunny would be. And for me, Benito exemplifies why it is that I'm vegan, why it is that we promote veganism, and that's because Benito has a right to his own little life. His flesh without wanting somebody to eat him, his fur without somebody wanting to wear him, and his eyes without somebody wanting to test products in him. That he's an individual that a lot of people don't get to know, like they don't get to know chickens or fish or
Mm.
sharks, who are my favorite animals. And so I think these stories are incredibly important when looking at human and non-human issues, because not everybody knows the experiences of that mother working two jobs in Vallejo, struggling to make ends meet, whose grocery store closes at 9 o'clock, and the only thing that's open is a fast food restaurant, and that's what she takes home to her kids at night. Nobody's going to know these stories of people who only have the food that they eat come out of a microwave. Nobody's going to know what's happening to women who are sexually harassed either in the restaurants, the fast food, or in the fields, unless we hear these stories and understand and gain empathy for them all. So I really thank you for making sure that these stories are told and heard in all these different capacities.
And I thank you for working to change a lot of these stories.
Thank you.
Um, so yeah, this was Lauren Ornelas, the founder of Food Empowerment Project. This was a wonderful conversation. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, and thanks for allowing me to share.
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please feel free to share it with your friends on social media, text it to your family if they think you might like it, send it to your activist group, GroupMe, or Signal Chat. Um, and yeah, and as I mentioned earlier, if you want to join the book club, our next two books are going to be Silent Spring and the fifth season. Um, Try one of those out. Just join our free email list. The link is in the description. All right, thanks so much.